In March of 1961, a man walked slowly through the Geneva Motor Show, saying almost nothing, studying the new cars on display one row at a time. He was one of the most famous men in the industry, the founder of a company that had spent a decade building the most desirable sports cars on Earth. And when he stopped in front of a car from Britain, a country whose sports cars he had never taken especially seriously, he is widely reported to have said something that no one expected to hear from him, that it was the most beautiful car ever made. The man was Enzo Ferrari. The car was the Jaguar E-Type. And whether or not he said those exact words that day, the story around them tells you everything about how disruptive this car really was, because it wasn't supposed to be possible. A British manufacturer building family saloons and mid-range sports cars had just built something that made the most romantic name in Italian motoring stop in its tracks. This is the story of how that happened. To understand why the E-Type landed the way it did, you have to go back further than 1961, back to a Jaguar that had already proven it knew how to build fast, beautiful cars, but hadn't yet built one that the entire world would remember. In 1948, Jaguar had launched the XK120, a car that briefly held the title of the fastest production car in the world, and that engine. A straight-six, twin-cam design engineered under William Haynes, became the backbone of everything Jaguar built for the next 2 decades. Through the early 1950s, Jaguar took that engine to Le Mans, first in the C-Type, then in the D-Type, and came home with 5 outright victories across the decade. By the time the 1950s were ending, Jaguar wasn't just a maker of handsome road cars. It was one of the most successful racing manufacturers in the world, and it had learned things at Le Mans about aerodynamics and lightweight construction that almost no road car company in Britain had access to. The man responsible for translating that knowledge into shape was not, by training, a car designer at all. His name was Malcolm Sayer, and before he ever sketched a Jaguar, he had spent the Second World War working as an aerodynamicist for the Bristol Aeroplane Company, designing aircraft. When Sayer joined Jaguar, he brought an entirely different mindset to car design than most of his contemporaries. Where other manufacturers styled a car and then tested it in a wind tunnel to see how it performed, Sayer worked in the opposite direction. He began with mathematics, with the physics of how air actually moves over a surface, and let the shape of the car emerge from those calculations. He treated a car's bodywork the way an aircraft engineer treats a wing. Not as a canvas for decoration, but as a surface with a job to do. This is the same approach he had already used to shape the C-Type and D-Type racers, and by the late 1950s, Jaguar's engineering team asked him to apply it to something new, a road car that could carry the design language of those Le Mans winners onto the streets. The project began quietly in 1957 under an internal code name, E1A. It was never intended for public eyes. Built as a rolling test bed, E1A existed purely to prove out a new monocoque chassis design and suspension geometry, refining ideas that would eventually define the finished car. When Jaguar's engineering chief, William Haynes, saw what Sayer and the team were building on top of that chassis, interest inside the company grew quickly, and a second prototype followed, E2A, completed in 1960. Unlike its predecessor, E2A wasn't kept hidden. It was entered into the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1960, wearing a shape that was recognisably close to what would become the production E-Type, though it failed to finish the race. E2A was shipped briefly to the United States afterward, before returning to Britain in 1961, by which point Jaguar's production version was almost ready, and the racing outing had done exactly what Jaguar needed it to do. It let the world see, in competition, the silhouette of what was coming, without yet revealing that this was a road car. What made the final production shape so effective wasn't just that it was elegant, it was that every visual element had a functional reason to exist. The long, sweeping bonnet wasn't stretched out for drama. It was shaped to house and cool the 6-cylinder engine while cutting drag at speed. The faired-in headlights, tucked behind smooth covers, reduced turbulence at the front of the car in a way that boxier headlight designs of the era simply couldn't match. The roofline of the coupe swept back in a single unbroken curve because that curve was the most efficient way to manage airflow over the cabin and off the tail. Sayer wasn't chasing beauty. He was chasing efficiency, and the beauty arrived as a side effect of getting the physics right, which is part of why the shape still looks correct today, more than 6 decades later, in a way that many deliberately styled cars from the same period do not. Jaguar kept the finished car under tight wraps right up until its debut, and the launch itself very nearly didn't happen the way history remembers it. Jaguar's founder, Sir William Lyons, had originally planned to bring a single E-Type to the Geneva Motor Show in March 1961. Only days before the show opened, he made the decision to send a second car, and getting that second car to Switzerland in time meant an overnight dash across Europe, with Jaguar's renowned test driver, Norman Dewis, driving an E-Type Roadster from the factory in Coventry to the show floor in Geneva, arriving with barely enough time to prepare the car before the doors opened to the public and press. Whatever stress that last-minute scramble caused behind the scenes, none of it showed once the car was revealed. Journalists who had come expecting another handsome but familiar British roadster found themselves looking at something that didn't resemble anything else on the show floor. Italian, German, American or British. Photographers crowded around it in numbers. Geneva organisers weren't prepared for. Crowds gathered 3 and 4 deep and simply refused to move on to the next stand. Reports from the show described Jaguar's own staff struggling to keep up with the volume of people wanting a closer look, wanting a test drive, wanting simply to touch the thing. It was in the middle of that reaction, as the story goes, that Enzo Ferrari made his remark. The quote has been repeated so many times over 6 decades that its exact wording and exact origin have become difficult to pin down with certainty, and some automotive historians note it rests largely on second-hand retellings rather than a confirmed, documented statement. But whether Ferrari's exact words were recorded precisely or not, the reaction he was reported to be reacting to was real, witnessed and photographed, and the quote stuck permanently to the E-Type's reputation because it captured something true. The most respected man in Italian sports cars had just been upstaged by a British manufacturer nobody expected to challenge him on pure beauty. And the E-Type wasn't just a beautiful shape wrapped around an ordinary car. Underneath the bodywork was a 3.8 litre straight-six engine descended directly from Jaguar's Le Mans winning C-Type and D-Type races, producing 265 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. Enough to make the E-Type a genuine 150-mile-an-hour car at a time when very few production vehicles anywhere in the world could make that claim. It was, in fact, the fastest production car available anywhere, just as Jaguar's earlier XK120 had been over a decade before. And then came the number that turned the E-Type from a remarkable car into an industry-altering one: its price. At launch, an E-Type cost roughly £2,250, including tax. A fraction of what a Ferrari or Aston Martin, with anything close to comparable performance, would cost a buyer at the time. Jaguar had built a car that looked like the most exotic thing on the road, performed like the fastest thing on the road, and was priced like neither. That combination: Ferrari baiting looks, genuine world-class performance, and a price within reach of a much wider group of buyers, is what actually made the E-Type dangerous to the rest of the industry, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because it explains why this car became more than just another fast British roadster. Ferrari, Aston Martin and the other manufacturers building genuinely exotic performance cars in 1961 weren't just selling engineering. They were selling exclusivity, and exclusivity depends on scarcity, on the fact that very few people can actually afford to own one. The E-Type quietly broke that model. It offered nearly all of the visual drama and genuine performance of those exotic cars, at a price point that put it within reach of a much larger pool of successful professionals, not just the extremely wealthy. For the first time, a car existed that let an ordinary successful person own something that looked and drove like it belonged to nobility. That accessibility helped turn the E-Type into a genuine cultural object almost immediately, not just an enthusiast's car. Actors, musicians, and other public figures of the 1960s were photographed with E-Types constantly, and the car became shorthand in film and television for a certain kind of effortless cool that fit perfectly with the era's cultural moment. The same years that gave the world the Beatles, mod fashion, and a new, younger, less formal idea of success. Decades later, in a recognition almost no production car has ever received, an E-Type was placed into New York's Museum of Modern Art as a permanent exhibit. Not displayed as a piece of engineering history, but exhibited as a genuine work of design, alongside sculpture and fine art. Very few objects that anyone can actually drive to the shops have ever been given that distinction. Jaguar didn't leave the E-Type static across its 14 years in production. The original Series 1 cars, built with that 3.8 litre engine, gave way in 1964 to an updated 4.2 litre version, offering more torque and a smoother, fully synchronised gearbox to replace the notoriously unforgiving unsynchronised first gear of the earliest cars. As the 1960s wore on, new safety and emissions regulations, especially in the crucial American market, where a huge share of E-Types were sold, forced further changes, raised bumpers, larger tail lights, and other adjustments that softened some of Sayre's original purity of line, changes that a great many purists still quietly regret. Then in 1971, Jaguar made its most dramatic change yet, replacing the straight six entirely with a new 5.3 litre V12, transforming the car's character from a razor-sharp sports car into something closer to a long-legged Grand Tourer. Across all three series, and more than a decade of continuous production, Jaguar built north of 70,000 E-Types in total, before the model was finally retired in 1975. Replaced, eventually, by the Jaguar XJS, a car with an entirely different job to do, and one that never carried quite the same weight of expectation. What's striking, looking back at the E-Type today, is how rarely a car manages to be all of the things it managed to be at once. It was fast enough to matter to genuine performance enthusiasts. It was beautiful enough to matter to people who had never cared about a car's specifications in their life. It was affordable enough that a working professional, and not only aristocrats and film stars, could realistically aim to own one. And it did all of that while coming from a company that, before 1961, most of the wider world didn't consider a serious rival to the great Italian and German marques. Malcolm Sayre never set out to build the most beautiful car ever made. By his own account, he was simply solving an aerodynamic problem as precisely as he could. But in solving it, he created a shape so correct, so free of unnecessary decoration, that more than 60 years later it remains one of the very few cars that people who have no interest in cars at all can still recognise instantly and still call beautiful without hesitation. That's a rare kind of achievement, and it's why, whatever Enzo Ferrari actually said on that show floor in Geneva in 1961, the sentiment behind the quote has never needed correcting. If a British manufacturer with a reputation for solid, sensible cars could quietly outdesign the most romantic name in the industry, it's worth asking what other British stories like this one are sitting there, half forgotten. That's exactly what this channel exists to dig up. One story at a time, every day. If you want the next one, make sure you're subscribed and tell me in the comments which British car deserves this treatment next.